The year was 2247, and humanity had finally reached the stars. But the stars had not welcomed them with open arms for 60 years. Humans had lived among the alien empires of the Galactic Concord, a coalition of 47 species that ruled over thousands of worlds. And in all that time, humanity had remained at the bottom of the ladder, tolerated but never respected, allowed to exist but never allowed to matter. The Cathari Empire called them the Brief Ones, because human lives were so short compared to their own 1,000-year lifespans. And the Velshan Dominion refused to even learn human languages because they considered it a waste of mental effort. And the other species simply ignored humanity altogether, treating them like children who had wandered into a room full of adults. Earth's representatives sat in the back rows of the Concord Council chambers. Their voices rarely heard and their votes rarely counted. And whenever a human diplomat tried to speak about expansion or exploration or progress, the elder species would share knowing looks and polite smiles that said everything without saying anything at all. But humanity had never been good at accepting its place. Captain Sarah Chun stood on the observation deck of the UES Prometheus, the largest vessel humanity had ever built. And she looked out at the crowd of 12,000 people who had gathered in the launch bay below. Families and scientists and dreamers who had volunteered for a journey that might never bring them home. The Prometheus was not just a ship. It was a statement, a declaration that humanity would not remain small forever. That the species which had crawled out of caves and crossed oceans and split atoms would not stop reaching simply because others told them to stop. "They think we are fools," said Commander David Okonkwo, who stood beside Captain Chun with his hands clasped behind his back. "The Cathari are already placing bets on how long we will survive." Captain Chun did not turn away from the window as she replied, "Let them bet, let them laugh, let them think whatever they want to think. Because when we return with knowledge they have never dreamed of, their laughter will turn to silence." The mission was simple in concept, but terrifying in scope. The Prometheus would travel to the void expanse, a region of space that every elder species had declared forbidden, a place where scanners showed nothing and probe ships never returned, a darkness at the edge of the known galaxy that had remained unexplored for 10,000 years. The Concord had warned humanity not to go, but their warnings had sounded less like concern and more like commands. And humans had never responded well to commands from those who considered themselves superior in the months before launch. Ambassador Michael Torres had stood before the Concord Council and announced humanity's intentions. And the chamber had erupted in what could only be described as condescending amusement. "The void expanse has claimed civilizations far greater than yours," the Cathari High Admiral had said, his 4 eyes blinking in what humans had learned to recognize as mockery. "Your little ship will vanish like all the others, and we will add your species to the list of those who reached too far." Ambassador Torres had simply smiled and replied, "Then you will not mind if we try." And so the Prometheus launched on a cold morning in March, its engines burning bright against the darkness of space, its hull carrying the hopes of an entire species that had grown tired of being told it was not enough. Captain Chun watched Earth grow smaller in the rear viewport, that blue and green marble that had given birth to dreamers and builders and explorers. And she made a silent promise that she would see it again, that she would bring her people home with wonders beyond imagination. The journey through known space took 3 months. And during that time, the crew of the Prometheus lived and prepared for whatever waited ahead. Children attended classes in the ship's schools, while scientists ran experiments in the laboratories. Couples got married in the observation lounges, and babies were born in the medical bays. And slowly the great ship became not just a vessel, but a community. A tiny piece of Earth sailing toward the unknown when the Prometheus finally reached the edge of the void expanse. Captain Chun ordered all stations to full alert, and 12,000 people held their breath as the ship crossed the boundary into darkness. At first, there was nothing, just empty space that seemed somehow emptier than the space they had left behind. Sensors that showed no stars and no planets and no sign that anything had ever existed in this place. And some of the crew began to wonder if the void was simply that, a void and nothing. A cosmic dead end that had claimed other ships through boredom rather than danger. But on the 17th day in the void, something changed. The ship's sensors detected an energy signature unlike anything in the Concorde's databases. A pulse of light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And Captain Chun ordered the Prometheus to follow it deeper into the darkness. "Captain," said the communications officer, her voice trembling with something between fear and excitement. "I am picking up a structure ahead, and it is massive. Larger than anything we have ever recorded. Larger than stations. Larger than planets. Larger than anything that should be possible." Captain Chun walked to the main viewport and looked out at what waited for them. And for the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to feel truly small. Before them hung a construct of impossible geometry. A thing of light and shadow and angles that hurt the mind to observe. A creation that could only have been built by beings who had mastered the very fabric of reality itself. "Send the message to Earth," Captain Chun said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell them we found something. Tell them it is beautiful." The communications officer sent the transmission. But something went wrong. The message became garbled and broken as it passed through the void. And by the time it reached Earth, only fragments remained. "We found something. It is beautiful." And then the Prometheus went silent on Earth. The message arrived like a ghost. A whisper from the darkness that left more questions than answers. And for weeks, the Concorde waited for another transmission that never came. Cathari collected their bets with smug satisfaction. And the other empires shook their heads at humanity's foolishness. And slowly the galaxy moved on to other matters while Earth mourned in silence. Decades passed. And the children who had watched the Prometheus launch grew old and died. And their children grew old and died. And the great ship faded from memory into legend, from legend into myth. From myth into a cautionary tale, the parents told their children about the dangers of reaching too far. A memorial was built on Luna, a simple stone monument that listed the names of 12,000 brave souls who had dared to dream. And every year fewer people came to visit, and every year the flowers left at its base grew fewer. And every year humanity sank a little deeper into acceptance of its place at the bottom of the galactic order. The fire that had once burned in human hearts grew dim. And the species that had crossed oceans and split atoms learned to bow its head and accept the scraps that the elder species offered. And the dream of the Prometheus became just another story of human failure, 187 years after the ship's disappearance. No one on Earth expected to ever learn what had happened to it. They were wrong. The border station called Sentinel-7 floated at the edge of Concorde space, a lonely outpost where nothing ever happened, where officers were sent as punishment and where careers went to die. And on this particular morning, the station's commander was drinking his fourth cup of stimulant tea while staring at screens that had shown the same empty void for the past 3 years of his assignment. Commander Thexner of the Vulcan Dominion was counting the days until his transfer when the alarms began to scream. At first, he thought it was a malfunction because nothing ever came from the void expanse. Nothing had come from that direction in 10,000 years, but the readings on his screen were impossible to ignore. A massive energy signature was emerging from the darkness. Something larger than any vessel in the Concorde fleet. Something that radiated power levels that his instruments were not designed to measure. "Get me a visual," he shouted to his crew, and when the image appeared on the main screen, every officer in the command center stopped breathing. A ship was emerging from the void, but calling it a ship seemed almost insulting, like calling an ocean a puddle or calling a mountain a hill. Because this vessel stretched across the viewport like a floating city, its hull gleaming with lights that pulsed in patterns that hurt the eyes to watch. Its design unlike anything in the Concorde's databases, unlike anything that any species had ever built. It cannot be, whispered one of the officers. Nothing survives the void. Commander Dexner opened a communication channel with trembling appendages and spoke the words that protocol demanded. Unidentified vessel, this is Concorde Border Station Sentinel-7. You have entered sovereign space. Identify yourself immediately. The response came in a language that the universal translator almost failed to recognize, because it had not been spoken in this region of space for nearly 200 years. But when the translation finally processed, the words made the commander's blood run cold. This is the United Earthship Prometheus. We have returned from the void expanse, and we come in peace. Within hours, the message had spread across the galaxy like wildfire, reaching every capital, world and every council chamber and every news network that broadcast to the trillions of beings who called the Concorde home. And the response was not wonder or celebration, but fear. The Prometheus had been gone for 187 years, and nothing survived the void expanse. So what exactly had come back? On the Concorde capital world of Nexus Prime, Ambassador Lyra Chun received the news while attending a diplomatic function that she had been dreading. Another evening of forced smiles and subtle insults from species that still considered humanity beneath their notice. She was the great-granddaughter of Captain Sarah Chun, a fact that had defined her entire life, a legacy of failure that she had tried to overcome through decades of diplomatic service. And when her assistant whispered the news in her ear, she dropped the glass she had been holding and watched it shatter on the floor without caring about the stares it attracted. The Prometheus, she whispered. It cannot be. But it was the Concorde Council convened in emergency session within the hour. And for the first time in decades, every species sent their highest representatives. Every empire paid attention. Every eye in the galaxy turned toward the impossible ship that had returned from the darkness. Admiral Vexter of the Kethari Empire was the first to demand action, his 4 eyes blazing with suspicion as he addressed the council. We do not know what this vessel truly is. We do not know what it carries. We do not know if it is even crewed by humans anymore. And I say we must board it immediately and determine if it poses a threat. The other military leaders voiced their agreement. A chorus of fear dressed up as caution, and within hours a fleet of Kethari warships was dispatched to intercept the Prometheus ambassador. Chun was ordered to accompany the fleet as the human representative. Though she knew her presence was not about diplomacy, but about optics, the Concorde wanted a human face to legitimize whatever they planned to do to a human ship. When the Kethari fleet arrived at the coordinates where the Prometheus waited, Admiral Vexter studied the vessel on his tactical display and felt something he had not felt in centuries of military service: uncertainty. The ship was massive, easily 10 times the size of his largest warship, but size alone was not what troubled him. It was the energy readings that his sensors were struggling to interpret. Power signatures that suggested technologies far beyond anything the Concorde had ever developed. Capabilities that should not exist according to the physics that govern the known universe human vessel. He broadcast on all frequencies. You will power down your systems and prepare to be boarded for inspection. This is not a request. The response came from a calm human voice. A man who identified himself as Captain Marcus Cole, 7th generation commander of the Prometheus. Admiral, we appreciate your concern, but we must respectfully decline your request. We mean no harm to the Concorde or any of its member species, and we ask only for the opportunity to return to our homeworld in peace. Admiral Vexter's eyes narrowed with anger that came from being refused by a species he had always considered inferior. and he ordered 3 of his warships to move into position around the Prometheus. Their weapons charged and their crews ready to fire. "You do not have the option to decline," he said. "You will submit to inspection, or you will be fired upon." What happened next would be discussed in military academies across the galaxy for centuries. To come, the 3 Cathari warships moved toward the Prometheus with their weapons hot. Their crews confident in their overwhelming firepower. Their commanders certain that no human vessel could stand against the might of the Empire. And then, without warning, all 3 ships stopped, not slowed, not disabled, but stopped as if someone had simply pressed a button and turned them off. Lights flickered and died. Engines went silent. Weapon systems shut down. And the crews found themselves floating in darkness, alive but helpless. Their mighty warships reduced to drifting hulks in a matter of seconds. Admiral Vexter watched in horror as his sensors reported the impossible. No weapons had been fired. No missiles had been launched. No energy beams had crossed the void between the ships. But somehow 3 of his most powerful vessels had been neutralized without a single shot. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice cracking with fear. He could not hide. Captain Cole's response was calm, almost gentle. "We gave them a chance to reconsider, Admiral. Their life support remains fully functional and their crews are unharmed. But their weapons will remain offline until we have departed. We did not come here to fight, but we will not allow ourselves to be bullied." The Admiral stared at his display, at the 3 dead ships that had been alive seconds ago, at the impossible readings that his instruments could not explain. And for the first time in his long life, he understood what it meant to be completely and utterly outmatched across the galaxy. Trillions of beings watched the confrontation unfold on their screens, and the fear that had been simmering since the Prometheus returned began to boil into something approaching. Terra Humanity had sent a ship into the void nearly 2 centuries ago. A primitive vessel crewed by a primitive species that the galaxy had dismissed as insignificant. And something had come back, something that could disable warships without firing a shot. Something that spoke with human voices but wielded power. That no human should possess. Ambassador Lyra Chun stood on the bridge of Admiral Vextar's flagship and watched the Prometheus hanging in space like a sleeping giant. And she wondered what her great-grandmother had found in the darkness, what secrets the void had revealed, and whether the ship that carried her family's name was still truly human at all. Answer to that question would change the galaxy forever. The shuttle carrying Ambassador Lyra Chun approached the Prometheus through a sea of stars that seemed to bend and shimmer around the great ship's hull. And as she drew closer, she began to understand why the Cathara sensors had struggled to make sense of what they were. Seeing the vessel was not simply large. It was alive in a way that machines should not be alive. Its surface rippling with patterns of light that moved like thoughts across a dreaming mind. Its structure seeming to shift and adjust as if the ship itself was aware of her approach and was welcoming her home. When the shuttle passed through the docking bay entrance, Lyra expected to find the cramped corridors and recycled air of a colonial vessel, the kind of ship that her great-grandmother had launched nearly 2 centuries ago. But what she found instead left her speechless. The interior of the Prometheus was a city. Vast open spaces stretched before her, filled with parks and plazas and buildings that reached toward a ceiling that glowed with artificial sunlight. And everywhere she looked, there were people, humans walking and talking and laughing. Children playing in fountains while their parents watched from benches nearby. A thriving community that had clearly existed for generations. "Welcome aboard the Prometheus," said a voice beside her. And Lyra turned to find a tall man with kind eyes and gray streaks in his dark hair, wearing a uniform that bore the old Earth insignia but updated in ways she did not recognize. "I am Captain Marcus Cole, and it is an honor to meet the great-granddaughter of Captain Sarah Chun." Lyra struggled to find words as she looked around at the impossible scene before her. How is this possible? How did you survive? Where did all these people come from? Captain Cole smiled and began to walk, gesturing for her to follow. The original crew numbered 12,000. But in 187 years, generations have been born and raised aboard this vessel. We now number over 3 million souls. And I am the 7th captain to command the Prometheus since your great-grandmother passed the responsibility to her successor. 3 million people, born and raised in the void, living in a ship that had somehow transformed from an exploration vessel into a floating world. As they walked through the city ship, Captain Cole told her the story that no one in the galaxy had ever heard. The truth about what the Prometheus had found in the darkness. When we entered the void expanse, we expected to find nothing or death, but instead we found something wonderful, he explained, leading her through a market where vendors sold goods that Lyra could not identify. We found the remnants of the architects, beings who existed before the current universe was born, who shaped galaxies and crafted stars and built wonders that your Concord species cannot imagine. Lyra felt her breath catch in her throat. You found an alien civilization? Not a living civilization, Captain Cole clarified. The architects were gone long before the first star of this universe ignited. But they left behind their knowledge, their technology, their understanding of reality itself, preserved in a structure so vast that it makes this ship look like a grain of sand on an infinite beach. He led her to a viewing window that looked out upon the ship's interior. And as Lyra watched, she saw things that defied explanation. Workers manipulating matter with their bare hands. Vehicles floating without visible propulsion. Children playing with toys that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once. For 187 years, we studied what the architects left behind. Captain Cole continued. We learned how to draw energy from the fabric of space itself, how to reshape matter at the atomic level, how to fold dimensions and travel distances that should take centuries in mere moments. Lyra's mind raced with the implications of what she was hearing. Why did the architects share this with you? Why humanity? Why not the elder species who entered the void before us? Captain Cole stopped walking and turned to face her with an expression that was both proud and humble. Because we asked, Ambassador. Because we approached the architect's legacy with curiosity instead of conquest. With questions instead of demands. Because we were willing to spend centuries learning rather than days taking. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small crystal that glowed with inner light. The other species who entered the void came looking for weapons, for power, for advantages over their enemies. And the architect's systems recognized their intentions and remained silent. But when humanity came seeking knowledge for its own sake, seeking understanding for the joy of understanding, the doors opened. Lyra took the crystal and felt warmth spread through her fingers. A sense of connection to something vast and ancient and impossibly kind. The Concord is terrified of you. They think you have returned to conquer them. I know, Captain Cole said with a sad smile. And I understand their fear, because we have returned with power beyond anything they have ever known. But we did not return to conquer, Ambassador. We returned because Earth is still our home. Because no matter how far we traveled or how much we learned, we never stopped being human. The news of what Lyra found aboard the Prometheus spread across the galaxy within hours. And the reaction was exactly what Captain Cole had predicted. Fear mixed with greed, mixed with desperation. The Concord Council convened an emergency session, and for the first time in its history, every seat was filled, every representative present. Every voice raised an argument about what to do with the impossible ship that had returned from the darkness. The Velshan Dominion proposed immediate military action, arguing that no single species should possess such overwhelming power, that humanity must be forced to share its technology or be destroyed before it became too strong to stop. The Cathari Empire demanded that all architect knowledge be surrendered to the Concord for safekeeping. their representatives speaking of responsibility and balance while their eyes betrayed their hunger for the secrets that could make them rulers of the galaxy. Other species took different positions, some calling for negotiation, some calling for isolation, some calling for alliances that would give them access to the power that humanity now wielded. But beneath all the arguments and proposals, one emotion dominated the chamber: fear. Fear of a species that had been dismissed and ignored and insulted for generations. Fear of the primitives who had somehow become giants. Fear of what humanity might do now that it had the power to do anything. Captain Cole requested permission to address the council. And after hours of debate, his request was granted. Though many representatives expected to hear threats and demands from this commander of an impossibly powerful vessel instead, Captain Cole stood before the assembled leaders of 47 species and spoke with a voice that carried no anger, no arrogance, no desire for revenge against those who had treated his people so poorly for so long. "We did not return to conquer," he said. "We did not return to punish. We did not return to claim what others have built or to destroy what others have created. We returned because Earth is our home and we missed it. We returned because the stars that you see every night are the same stars that our ancestors saw when they first looked up from their caves and wondered what was out there." He paused and looked around the chamber at faces that showed confusion and suspicion and reluctant hope. "The architects gave us their knowledge because they believed that wisdom comes before power, because they understood that any species can destroy, but only a species with heart can build. And we have spent nearly 2 centuries learning to be worthy of what they gave us." His final words echoed through the chamber and would be repeated on news broadcasts across the galaxy for years to come. "We do not ask for your respect because we can defeat you. We ask for your respect because we have chosen not to, and we hope that in time you will understand the difference." The council sat in stunned silence as Captain Cole turned and walked away, leaving behind questions that would take years to answer and a galaxy that would never be the same. The weeks following Captain Cole's address to the council were filled with chaos as the galaxy struggled to decide how to respond to humanity's return. And in the end, fear won out over reason. Admiral Vexter had not forgotten the humiliation of his warships being disabled like toys, and he had spent every moment since that day building a coalition of species who shared his belief that humanity must be stopped before it was too late. "They speak of peace," he said to the gathered commanders from 7 different empires. "They speak of wisdom and restraint, but words are easy when you hold all the power. And I do not trust any species to remain peaceful when they have the ability to crush all opposition." The commanders nodded in agreement, each of them representing military forces that had kept their empires strong for millennia, each of them unwilling to accept that a species they had dismissed as primitives could now threaten everything they had built within a month. The largest fleet in galactic history had been assembled, 10,000 warships from 7 empires, carrying millions of soldiers and enough firepower to crack planets, all united by a single purpose: to destroy the Prometheus before humanity could use its power to dominate the galaxy. Ambassador Lyra Chun learned of the fleet's formation through back channels and immediately requested an emergency meeting with Captain Cole. Racing to the Prometheus aboard a small shuttle as news of the coming battle spread across the stars. "They are going to attack," she said as she burst onto the bridge of the great ship. 10,000 ships, Captain. They believe that numbers will overwhelm your technology." "Captain." Cole sat in his command chair with the calm demeanor of someone who had expected exactly this outcome. "I know, Ambassador. We have been tracking their movements since the coalition first formed." Lyra stared at him in disbelief. "Then, why have you done nothing? Why have you not tried to stop them? Why have you not fled?" The captain turned to look at her with eyes that held no fear but only sadness. "Because running would prove them right. because threatening them would prove them right. Because the only way to truly change their minds is to show them who we have become. The fleet arrived 3 days later, emerging from hyperspace in a formation designed to surround the Prometheus on all sides. And Admiral Vexter broadcast his ultimatum on every frequency. Human vessel, you are surrounded. Surrender your ship and your technology or be destroyed. You have 1 hour to comply. Across the galaxy, trillions of beings watched the confrontation unfold on their screens, some cheering for the fleet that they hoped would protect them from the unknown, others watching in horror as their governments prepared to destroy a ship that had done nothing wrong on Earth. People gathered in the streets and looked up at the stars, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, the fate of their entire species was being decided. Captain Cole did not respond to the ultimatum. And as the hour passed, Admiral Vexter allowed himself a smile of satisfaction, believing that the humans had finally realized they could not fight an entire galaxy. All ships, he commanded. Open fire. 10,000 ships unleashed their weapons simultaneously. A storm of energy and missiles and destruction that could have burned entire worlds. All of it directed at a single target that hung motionless in the void. What happened next lasted exactly 11 minutes. The weapon's fire reached the Prometheus and simply stopped. Not deflected or absorbed, but stopped, as if the missiles and energy beams had decided to take a break from existing. Then, the Prometheus responded. There was no visible weapon, no flash of light, no beam of energy that sensors could track. But across the battlefield, ships began to die. Not in explosions, but in silence, their systems shutting down one by one. Their weapons going dark, their engines falling quiet. Their crews finding themselves adrift in vessels that no longer obeyed their commands. Admiral Vexter watched his tactical display with growing horror as green lights turned red across the board. As ship after ship reported total system failure, as his mighty fleet was reduced to a collection of helpless hulks floating in the darkness. Impossible, he whispered. This is impossible. By the time the 11 minutes had passed, all 10,000 ships had been disabled. Their weapons inert, their engines cold, their communications limited to short-range signals that could not call for help. But something remarkable had also happened. Not a single crew member had died. Life support remained functional on every vessel. And emergency supplies have been automatically activated. And the millions of soldiers who had expected to die in glorious battle found themselves very much alive, staring at blank screens and wondering what force could have defeated them so completely without taking a single life. Captain Cole's voice echoed through every speaker on every ship in the defeated fleet. Calm and clear, and carrying no trace of triumph or anger. We could have killed you all. Every ship, every soldier, every commander who voted for this attack. We had the power to turn your fleet into debris and your crews into memories. But we chose not to, because this is who humanity has become. We do not seek your destruction. We only ask for your respect. Admiral Vexter sat in his command chair, surrounded by darkness and silence, and felt something he had not felt in 800 years of military service. Shame. He had led the largest fleet in galactic history against a single ship, and that ship had defeated him without firing a single shot, had spared his life and the lives of millions of his soldiers without being asked, had shown mercy when it had every reason to show wrath on the Concord capital world. Ambassador Lyra Chun stood before the council and delivered the message that Captain Cole had asked her to share. For 187 years, humanity learned in the void, she said. We learned sciences that your species have not dreamed of. We learned technologies that could reshape the universe, but most importantly, we learned restraint. She looked around at the representatives who had ordered the attack, at the leaders who had thought themselves so powerful, at the faces that now showed fear and confusion and the first hints of understanding. The Prometheus has had the power to destroy the Concorde since the moment it returned. But destroying you is never our goal, and it never will be. We came home because we missed the stars that our ancestors saw. Because Earth is still the world we dream of. Because no matter how far we traveled, we never stopped being the curious creatures who looked up at the night sky and wondered what was out there. She paused and let her words sink into the chamber. You called us primitives. You called us the brief ones. You placed bets on our deaths and laughed at our ambitions. And we could have returned your cruelty with devastation beyond your imagination. But we chose not to, and that choice is the measure of who we have become. The council sat in silence as Lyra walked to the center of the chamber and looked up at the great dome that displayed the stars. The fleet you sent to destroy us is drifting helpless in space. Every crew member alive, every soldier waiting to be rescued. And when you bring them home, ask them what they learned today. Ask them what it felt like to be shown mercy by a species they considered inferior. And then ask yourselves if you still believe that power is the only measure of worth. The elder speakers, the representatives of the oldest species in the Concorde, exchanged glances that carried the weight of millennia of experience. They had seen empires rise and fall, had watched species destroy themselves in pursuit of power, had witnessed countless civilizations that had reached the stars only to burn themselves out in war and conquest. And in all those ages, they had never seen what they saw today, a species that had been given the power of gods and had chosen to remain kind one of them. A being so ancient that its name had been forgotten by everyone except itself, rose from its seat and spoke the words that would change the galaxy forever. Perhaps we have misjudged humanity. Perhaps it is time to reconsider our assumptions. It was not much. Just a few words from an elder who rarely spoke, but it was a beginning. A crack in the wall of prejudice that had surrounded humanity for generations, and from small cracks, great changes flow. 1 year had passed since the battle that was not a battle, and the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The defeated fleet had been rescued and returned to their homeworlds, and the soldiers who had expected to die in glorious combat went home to their families with stories that sounded like myths. Tales of a ship that could have destroyed them all, but chose to let them live. Of humans who had been given the power of gods, but remained human. Admiral Vexter had resigned his commission and retreated to his ancestral estate, where he spent his days staring at the stars and wondering how he had so badly misjudged a species that he had dismissed as primitives. And when reporters asked him about the battle, he said only this: I went to war against Mercy, and Mercy won. The Concorde Council had spent months debating what to do about humanity, and in the end, the elder speakers had made the decision that no one expected. Humanity would be offered a seat on the High Council, not as a minor species, but as equals, as partners in the governance of a galaxy that they now had the power to rule, but had chosen to serve some empires resisted, their pride wounded by the idea of treating former primitives as peers. But the resistance faded when they remembered what had happened to the fleet, when they remembered that humanity had already shown it could defeat them all, and had chosen not to. And through all of this, the Prometheus waited patiently in orbit around a distant moon, its 3 million citizens going about their daily lives while the galaxy decided their fate. Children attending classes and couples getting married and babies being born. Life continuing as it had continued for 187 years in the void. But finally, after a year of negotiations and debates and slow changes of heart, the day came that Captain Marcus Cole had been waiting for since the moment the Marker Prometheus returned from the darkness. The ship was going home. Ambassador Lyra Chun stood on the bridge of the Prometheus as the great vessel began its journey toward Earth, and she found herself standing next to Captain Cole as the stars streamed past the viewport. How does it feel? She asked. To be so close to home after all this time? Captain Cole was quiet for a long moment before he answered. I have never seen Earth, Ambassador. None of us have. We know it only from the records and stories passed down through generations. From the images that our ancestors brought with them and the memories that they shared with their children. He turned to look at her with eyes that held both joy and sorrow. For 187 years, Earth was a dream, a legend, a place that we knew existed but could never touch. And now we are finally going to see if the dream matches the reality. The journey took only 3 days, a distance that would have taken the original Prometheus months to travel. And as the ship approached the Sol system, word spread across the galaxy that the moment had finally arrived on Earth. Billions of people gathered in open spaces to watch the sky. Families and friends and strangers standing side by side, united by the knowledge that their lost children were finally coming home. The Prometheus entered Earth's orbit at precisely noon, universal time, and its shadow fell across continents as it positioned itself above the blue and green world that had given birth to dreamers and explorers and builders. Captain Cole stood at the main viewport and looked down at the planet that his ancestors had left behind, at the oceans and forests and cities that he had seen only in images, at the world that had been a prayer whispered by generations of his people in the darkness of the void. It is more beautiful than the stories, he said, his voice thick with emotion. The shuttle descended through clouds that tasted like home, through air that carried the sense of a world that 3 million people had never breathed, through a sky that was bluer than any recording could capture when the shuttle landed on the grounds of the Luna Memorial, the memorial that had been built to honor the 12,000 souls who had been lost in the void. Captain Cole walked down the ramp and set foot on Earth for the first time in his family's history. He knelt on the grass that was greener than anything that grew on the Prometheus, and he pressed his hands against soil that his ancestors had walked on, soil that held the bones of generations of humans who had lived and loved and dreamed. We are home, he whispered, and tears streamed down his face. Tears that fell on Earth's soil for the first time in 187 years. Behind him, thousands of his people followed, stepping off shuttles and touching ground that their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents had only dreamed of. And the sounds of weeping filled the air as a lost people finally found what they had been searching for. Ambassador Lyra Chen watched the reunion from a distance, and she felt her own tears falling as she thought of her great-grandmother, of Captain Sarah Chen, who had led these people into the darkness with a promise that she would bring them home. The promise had been kept, not by Sarah Chen, but by the generations that followed her, by children who had learned to master the secrets of the universe but had never forgotten where they came from. In the months that followed, the Prometheus became more than a ship. It became a symbol, a reminder that power without wisdom was worthless and that mercy was stronger than force. Captain Cole began sharing the knowledge of the architects, not all at once but slowly and carefully, choosing species that proved themselves worthy, offering cures for diseases that had plagued civilizations for millennia, providing energy sources that could end scarcity, teaching sciences that could transform societies. A plague had been killing millions on a distant Cathari colony world, a disease that their own scientists had been unable to cure. And when a human medical ship descended from the sky and offered to help, the colonists did not know what to expect. The cure took 3 days, and when it was done, not a single life had been lost. A young Cathari girl watched the human ship depart and asked her father what those beings were, those strange creatures who had come from the stars to save her people without asking for anything in return. Her father was silent for a long moment, remembering the stories he had been told about humans, about primitives and weaklings and the brief ones who were not worth respecting. They are humanity, he finally said. And once we thought them weak, but we were wrong. On Earth, The memorial on Luna was expanded to include new names, the names of every person who had been born on the Prometheus during its journey, every child who had grown up in the void, every generation that had kept the dream of home alive through decades of darkness. Captain Cole visited the memorial often, standing before the stone that bore his ancestor's name, speaking to her across the years that separated them. "You were right, great-great-grandmother," he said on one visit. "It was beautiful." And we found our way home. Ambassador Lyra Chun found him there one evening, standing in the moonlight with his head bowed. And she came to stand beside him in comfortable silence. "The council has voted," she finally said. "Humanity will be given permanent membership on the High Council, with full voting rights and equal standing." Captain Cole nodded but did not smile. "It is not about the council seats, Ambassador. It was never about power or recognition or revenge." Lyra looked at him curiously. Then what was it about? He turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw the accumulated wisdom of 187 years of learning, of generations who had been given the power to dominate the galaxy and had chosen a different path. "It was about proving that we are worthy of the stars," he said. "The architects showed us civilizations that tried to rule through force, empires that believed that might made right. And they are all gone now, erased from history, forgotten by a universe that does not mourn the powerful." He looked up at the night sky, at the stars that had called to humanity since the first ancestors had walked out of caves. "Power without wisdom is just a longer path to extinction. Ambassador, we learned patience, we learned humility, and we learned that the greatest strength is not the ability to destroy, but the choice not to." Lyra followed his gaze to the stars and thought about everything that had happened, about a species that had been dismissed and ignored and insulted, about a ship that had vanished into darkness and returned with the power to reshape the universe, about a people who had been given the gifts of gods and had chosen to remain human. "What happens now?" she asked. Captain Cole smiled, and in that smile was the hope of every generation that had lived on the Prometheus. Every child who had grown up dreaming of a world they had never seen. Every soul who had believed that someday, somehow, they would find their way home. "Now we help others find their way," he said. "Not because we want to rule them, but because we remember what it was like to be lost. And no one should have to find their way alone." Above them, the Prometheus hung in orbit around Earth, a guardian and a symbol and a promise. A reminder that humanity had left as explorers and returned as something the galaxy had never seen before. A species that had been given the power of gods and had chosen to remain kind in the years that followed. When beings across the galaxy looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there, they no longer thought of the darkness or the danger or the empires that ruled through force. They thought of the humans. And they wondered what else those strange creatures might teach them about the power of mercy.